Benjamin Disraeli, Chancellor of the Exchequer in Lord Derby's Conservative ministries, was an unlikely candidate to pilot through the Commons the first successful parliamentary reform measure in over 30 years. Like many in his party, Disraeli had shown little interest in electoral reform since entering Parliament in 1837, despite having attempted on 3 previous occasions to enter the Commons as a radical. Instead, Disraeli became one of the party's most eloquent speakers on the need to defend the monarchy, the landed interest, and the Anglican Church against rising democratic pressures. In this spirit, in 1848, he spoke against the radical MP Joseph Hume's Little Charter of Electoral Reforms, which included household suffrage and the secret ballot. Disraeli did, however, admit that some measure of reform might be necessary in the future. When Lord John Russell's attempted reform bills in the early 1850s put the issue back on the agenda for frontbench politicians, Disraeli wanted to ensure that the Conservatives were not perceived as unthinking opponents of reform, as they had been during the reform crisis of 1830 to 1832. Instead, Disraeli wanted the party to seize the initiative and, by shaping reform to their advantage, reap the electoral rewards. The Conservatives' first attempt to do so in 1859 ended in defeat. This was largely because their measure did not extend the franchise in the boroughs, which would have won them opposition votes. But the sudden fall of the Liberal ministry over their own reform bill in 1866 gave the Conservatives another opportunity. Seeking to outbid the Liberal leadership and secure the votes their minority government needed, the Conservative Ministry's Bill of 1867 made household suffrage the basis of the borough franchise. This was, on the surface at least, a much bolder proposition than that made by the Liberals the year before. Meanwhile, to keep his own backbenchers on board, various safeguards were added to reassure them that the Conservatives would not be disadvantaged by the bill. This included shoring up their vote in the county seats and limiting the impact of household suffrage by accompanying it with a 2-year residence requirement and the personal payment of rates. "I defy any person to show me a measure which the House has passed of a more popular and at the same time of a more conservative character," Disraeli told the Commons on the bill's second reading on the 26th of March 1867. "I cannot apprehend that the number that will be admitted within the pale of the Constitution by the scheme which we propose will be so great as to cause any distrust or alarm." However, as Disraeli was forced to accept a string of backbench amendments that weakened or removed his safeguards, the Reform Act of 1867 became a far more radical measure than he had intended. It enfranchised 3 times the number that would have gained the vote under Gladstone and Russell's Bill of 1866. When the country went to the polls in 1868, Disraeli, now Prime Minister, hoped the Conservatives stood a good chance of reaping the electoral dividend as the party that had delivered reform. But these hopes too were dashed. The Liberals were returned to government with a majority of over 100 seats. Despite this short-term setback, in the longer term, the Reform Act of 1867, combined with the social reforms associated with Disraeli's second ministry of 1874 to 1880, did much to embed the idea of Tory democracy and one-nation conservatism that became a potent electoral force in the years to come.